for which Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan is an ideology. And their belief is that India is a purely Hindu country, that all others are here either as guests or have broken into our home as bandits and dacoits. That is the ideology of Hindutva, very clearly stated by the ideologues who have written these books. There have been very many examples of blatant discrimination against particularly Muslims, the so-called bulldozer diplomacy, the only ones whose homes are demolished. Many people in India construct homes without proper permits. The only ones whose homes are demolished by bulldozers are Muslims. You have passed the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA. The only ones who are thrown into jail as suspected terrorist sympathizers without bail are Muslims. The Citizenship Amendment Act, for the first time, introduces a litmus test that says any refugee from a neighboring country can get fast-track citizenship in India, provided they're not Muslim. So for the first time, you have religion coming in to determine a right of citizenship. Will always survive. For 8.5 years, I have never seen a single bill brought before Parliament for a vote in which the government made a single amendment that was suggested by an opposition or non-BJP MP. Not one. At one time, under Nehruji, used to meet for about 250 days in the year. Today, it is down to just over about 100 days in the year, whose constitution enshrined the idea that everyone is equal, whatever your race, your religion, your caste, your color, your language, your region of birth, nothing mattered. If you are an Indian citizen, you have equal rights. That was the fundamental difference. Now, the EWS judgment says, but on economics, society, politics, and democracy, it's in your hands. You must decide your own future and the future of India.
What are the global implications and opportunities that India had in 2023 regarding taking up the presidency of G20 summit as well as SCO, and as well in the next month India is going to be held the UNSC presidency? Regarding your opinion, please.
Well, next month is also our last month on the Security Council. So we'll hold the presidency, but thereafter we leave the Security Council. So that's not a long-term position. However, we will indeed be president of both the G20 and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a very unusual combination, because the G20 is a global body that looks after the macroeconomic issues in the world, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a much smaller body of East Asian countries, which is normally considered to be under the strong influence, if not domination, of China and Russia. So for India to be associated with both, in some ways is part of our overall strategy of being partners with everybody. It's been very striking, if you look at it, that every year our foreign minister meets with the foreign ministers of Russia and China in a grouping called RIC. Then he adds the Brazilians and the South Africans to the same, and it becomes BRICS. And then he removes the Russians but keeps the Chinese for basic, for environmental negotiations. And then he removes both the Chinese and the Russians for IPSA, which is the India, Brazil, South Africa, South-South Cooperation Forum. So we are in various kinds of configurations, and not only because our country's name begins with that very essential element in any acronym, which is a vowel, but also because we have something useful to contribute to all of these bodies, and they in turn have something to gain from our participation. So this is not so much non-alignment, the old Mudra-Vakyam. It is now multi-alignment. And that is the term that I came up with when I was minister 12 years ago, and at that time no one took it up. But now I'm very pleased to say that the present government has found that phrase useful, and it's increasingly being used by the government, multi-alignment, as a legitimate strategy of India. You say, what are the possibilities? The possibilities are for certainly both enhanced global as well as regional influence. The question is how we use that influence, particularly when it comes to economic challenges, because there is a widespread belief that the world is facing a recession. A recession, as you all know, you must know this, it's a basic concept in economics, is a period in which in at least one quarter there is negative rate of growth. You understand, economic growth is always in positive terms. So you may grow by 2%, you may grow by only 0.3%, whatever, but you grow. That's the normal way of life. But when there is a recession, the economy shrinks and you have negative growth. Now, if that's expected around the world, it can have a terrible effect, because when there is recession, the prices of land will drop, the prices of property will drop, salaries will drop, unemployment will increase. It becomes a much more difficult and unsustainable period. In those circumstances, for a country like India, what stands we take will be of great interest. First of all, to the other countries, particularly other developing countries, and secondly, will be of great importance to our own people, because if we can influence the direction of the world economy in such a way that we can help our own people to grow and flourish better, then that is indispensable for India. So the possibilities are there, but they're also uncertain, and it depends on our ability and our smarts to guide the world economy in the right direction. Some of our existing steps, which have popular support in India, are seen with dismay abroad. An example is Make in India, because Make in India is a protectionist policy which raises tariffs and taxes on imported goods, goods coming from other countries, in favor of those goods made in India. Now, we in India, we welcome that because Indian manufacturers benefit. But from a global point of view, it means a shrinking of the possibilities of world trade and of integration with foreign economies, with global economies. And equally, the concern is that the Indian consumer may pay more for less high quality goods than could be imported because of the tariffs on import and the protection given to domestic industry. So these are all difficult choices that have to be made. You make a choice in a democracy very often, not because it is the best option favored by economists, but because you want to win votes. And that is not necessarily a good recipe for economic growth. By and large, it's been established that trade benefits all. But it is also true that your own domestic industries often feel that they're not able to compete with foreign manufacturers, and therefore they ask for protection. And these are political choices that the government of the day has to make.
Sir, next question.
Sir, first of all, I am expressing my gratitude and excitement.
Can you raise the mic a little closer to you?
Sir, first of all, I am expressing my gratitude and excitement to interact with you. Today, the technology is changing rapidly and manifesting every aspect of life, and data is the new oil of the century.
Little closer.
Recently, the data protection bill was withdrawn from the parliament and planning to introduce a new one. So, my question is, how complex the process of framing a legal framework which regulate the cyberspace and data privacy of the citizens of the country?
It's a very complex process, but the government has made it more difficult than it needs to be. There are very good data protection bills around the world. The European Union has a very highly respected standard called the GDPR. Most Western democracies have excellent data protection bills. It would not have been difficult for us to be inspired by other countries' models. Unfortunately, our government has written a very restrictive data protection bill. There is now a new draft that has come out, which on the one hand is very business friendly, in that it makes things very easy for businesses to be able to function, to start in India, to thrive in India, and so on. But any protection that is afforded to the citizens of India for their personal data is overridden when it comes to the government. The government can essentially take anybody's data and use it and misuse it as they wish, as long as they claim it is on grounds of national security, sovereignty, friendly relations with foreign states, and so on. And no one can challenge the government even in a court of law. There is a data protection authority that has been created. But instead of that being an independent body, it is a body consisting entirely of government civil servants. So civil servants will be the ones signing the order to sequester your data. And if you appeal saying the government has no right to take my data, Civil servants will decide. So the result is the government has total control. It is an extremely regressive draft, which very many people in our country are extremely alarmed about. Already a spate of articles have come out expressing grave concern about this draft, and we will have to have some serious discussions in Parliament. But the government has a brute majority, and I really worry about this bill. It gets even more serious because this bill has been delayed so much that various laws have been passed which involve the government collecting your data. For example, the DNA bill. The government can take your DNA, and now under this bill they can keep it or use it or misuse it as they wish, and they are untouchable. Now that's not how a democracy is supposed to function. In a democracy, the citizens should have protection from the government also. Not only from each other, not only from criminal syndicates. We need protection to ensure that the government, for political reasons or other reasons, doesn't misuse their access to citizens' data. For example, we know for a fact that there has been a great deal of tapping of telephones in our country. Many politicians' phones have been tapped. And the worry about this is, under this new data protection law, whereas under the old law, illegal telephone tapping was justiciable. You could go to the courts and actually fines were supposed to be imposed on those who did illegal tapping of your phone. Today, they are completely protected and they have impunity against any improper behavior. It's shocking.
So next question.
Good morning, sir. Citing climate of harassment and intimidation, Amnesty International put an end to their operations in India. And you yourself said few years back that charging Amnesty with sedition is a big mistake. In the Indian context, do you think Amnesty International was more vocal in raising their voice than UN, where it remained a mute spectator to specific atrocities, sir?
Yeah, I'm also very disappointed with that action of the government because I believe that Amnesty International has unparalleled credibility around the world as a human rights body. And remember that the staff of Amnesty International in India were Indians. The head of Amnesty International was a very well-known journalist and columnist called Akar Patel. There is no question that you are looking at an organization that has great credibility around the world. And therefore, it would have been extremely unfortunate for the government to take the action they did because it has actually downgraded the image of India as a democracy with respect for human rights. It has not been a good development at all, I must say. And my own concern remains very strong that by doing all this, India is sending a signal that it doesn't care about human rights. Whereas, in fact, the line to have taken is, we welcome amnesty, but we have many human rights organizations in India, and we will listen to these organizations that are rooted in our soil, and we will consider amnesty as one amongst them. That's all we needed to say. Instead of this persecution and harassment and restriction on their funding and so on, all of which, as you said, led them to leave the country, we should have behaved like a democracy. But unfortunately, in recent years, this government has not been behaving very democratically when it comes to such issues. And if you look at a long list of international rankings, we have slid down the rankings for press freedom, we've slipped down the rankings for human rights. In all of these areas, India's ranking has gone further and further down. And the worry I have about this is that we are doing ourselves a disservice. We have created a situation where our government is undermining our credibility as a democracy. Most unfortunate. And in fact, the famous Varieties of Democracy Institute, VDEM Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, has actually said that India is not a democracy anymore, we are an electoral autocracy. That is, we elect our government freely, but once they're elected, they behave autocratically and not democratically. That is a shameful reputation to have.
So, my question is regarding the complex interdependence model. So, with the limited knowledge I have of IR, I have pinned a question. Suppose 2008 we see a globalized world where economic interdependence has become the key and multipolarity has become a demand. And India has been demanding multipolarity like most Asian countries. But yet again, There's weaponized interdependence, mostly by the West, especially USA's recent swift sanctions against Russia. So, where does India's balance lie to navigate this complex cobweb model? Would this be used against us? Because neoliberalism tells us about centralized and about decentralized units of power, but clearly it's asymmetrical right now. So, where does India lie?
That's a very thoughtful, very, very smart question. Thank you, young lady. The world will always be asymmetrical. Let's realize that. There's no question about the fact that we live in a world where every state is supposed to be equal, but when you sit around a table with various states, the bigger, more powerful states are bound to be more powerful and therefore displace greater weight than the smaller state. That's normal human fact of life. For example, if you talk in the Security Council, each country has one vote. But we all know that for 14 countries, their relationship with the 15th country, the United States, weighs heavily on their mind before they take a stand that will make the US unhappy. Tomorrow they may be thinking the same way about both the US and China, because China is also becoming a superpower. So this is the reality of the world, so don't be misled into thinking with too much idealism. We have to be, especially if you join the civil services, you will have to have the sense to realize that we have to operate in the real world and not in the theoretical or ideal world. Having said that, yes, there's an old line, I'm trying to remember, it is Voltaire or somebody else who said that the strong act as they wish and the weak act as they must. And that is something which we really find more and more happening in parts of international affairs. Russia, by invading Ukraine, has also shown that it is among the strong countries, that it can openly violate the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force to settle international disputes. And nobody can do anything about it. Yes, the West has imposed sanctions, but not every country has agreed with that. There are no UN sanctions on Russia. There are unilateral sanctions by Western countries. And therefore, you're finding a situation where countries like India have actually increased their trade with Russia rather than sanctioning it. So, if you are powerful enough and you have enough that the world needs, you can get away with a lot. And that is the truth about world affairs. I'm being very blunt with you. And the United Nations is a mirror of the world. It reflects our agreements and disagreements, our different sizes and strengths, our different weights in world affairs. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. The General Assembly may be one vote per state, but in the Security Council and the key decision-making bodies, have no illusions. The more powerful will more often than not get their way. But don't forget, we are seeing violations of the Charter by many. The US marched into Iraq without the approval of the Security Council. Russia marched into Ukraine without the approval of the Security Council. China marched into Tibet back in 1950 without the approval of the Security Council. So you're looking at case after case where those who feel they are powerful enough to get away with certain kinds of action will do so. And as far as India is concerned, we respect international law, but I too think that in our own neighborhood, if necessary, we may well be capable of acting without much regard for the ideal prescriptions of law if we believe that our overriding national interest demands it. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it is part of the reality we live with. When it comes to things like sanctions on Russia, as I said, we are not playing ball with that. But you must understand that some have greater power. For example, the US, when they really are determined, they will not, for example, on the sanctions on Iran, they not only sanctioned Iran, but if countries and companies that did not sanction Iran traded with Iranian companies, those Indian companies, for example, were barred from any dollar transactions. And that means you can't do international trade because most of international trade is in dollars, which is why even our current trade with Russia is now ruble-rupee, right? Ruble-rupee trade, because that cannot be sanctioned by the Americans. These are some of the new developments in international affairs which are worth watching, and I'm sure, judging by the very knowledgeable question you asked, that you're watching it very closely.
Hi sir, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Saliha and my question is, French government has recently honored you with the highest civilian award, Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, for your speech in French. But sir, back in India, we have to give a compulsory Hindi test to get into the central universities, and the ministers in your parliament had the audacity to respond in Hindi for the question in Tamil. Sir, does this problem of language have a bureaucracy solution, or is it central to a political question, sir?
It is a political question, but it's also a constitutional one. Our country is a federal country. We have a number of states put together. And it is a basic reality that many states do not use Hindi, do not master Hindi, and do not see the need to do so. It is also true that we are currently ruled by a party for which Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan is an ideology. And it has been a slogan of theirs for very many years. Now, in those circumstances, they will continue trying to push Hindi down our throats, and we will continue trying to resist it. Not because we can't speak Hindi, but because we feel it will be unfair in our society if you create Hindi as a more equal than others language when it comes to government, administration, judiciary, and national correspondence, and so on. Then you will create a situation in which, Shukla and Singh will have a language they have learned in their mother's laps. But Subramaniam and Reddy and Menon will have absolutely no clue what's being said, and they will have to make an extra effort to learn a language that they're not comfortable with at first hand. In other words, it'll become an uneven playing field, and some people will have an advantage that other people do not. Now, is that fair in a federal country? The answer is clearly not. In a federal country, everybody in every state should have an equal opportunity to rise to the civil service, to get to the top positions, to be in authority, to be a judge, and so on. Just last week, there was an episode where a petitioner insisted on speaking Hindi, and the Malayali judge, Justice K.M. Joseph, very politely told him, sorry, the language of this court is English. I can't understand what you're saying. We will assign you a lawyer who will explain what you want in English. So these are the kind of challenges, when you have our BJP foreign ministers, not Jaishankar, but before that, Sushma Swaraj, and earlier under Vajpayee, insisting on speaking Hindi at the United Nations, which meant India had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to translate that Hindi into other languages. The question that came to my mind, and I asked it in Parliament, is what happens if you have a Bengali foreign minister or a Tamil foreign minister? Why do you want to set a precedent that you will only speak Hindi? After all, it's an advantage. We had 200 years of colonialism, which I'm bitterly opposed to. But one of the advantages that it left behind was the English language. Let's use it. It gives us a direct means of communication with the rest of the world. Not just with the English-speaking countries, but English is the second language for most countries in the world. There was a time in the 17th, 18th, 19th century when French was the language of international diplomacy. Today, no doubt about it, it's English. I remember when the leaders of France and Germany met face to face. The Frenchman didn't know German, the German didn't know French, they talked to each other in English. That was what used to happen, and that's something we should understand is very useful. So we are going to generate only leaders and ministers who can only speak Hindi. We are putting ourselves in a disadvantage with the rest of the world. Because when you work through a translator, it's never the same thing as when you speak directly to someone.
So, my question is regarding EWS reservation system. What is your take on EWS, and can India put forward it as a new, unique model for poverty eradication, as well as can we consider it as the hope for most oppressed class in the world?
So this is the philosophical issue that the Supreme Court was divided in resolving. As you know, the decision was 3-2 in the Supreme Court. The philosophical issue is reservations a provision meant to undo millennia of social discrimination only, or is reservation a tool to benefit the poorer sections of society? Now, when the first question of reservation came up, it was meant to be only for SCs and STs. That is, people who for 3,000 years have been oppressed in an unequal social system. Then, in 1989, came the Mandal Commission decision of the VP Singh government, 1990, and we had OBC reservations. Then with 50% reservation in the country, the judiciary started ruling in against the so-called creamy layer. What are the creamy layer? People saying, well, here is somebody who may be a Dalit or maybe an OBC, but their father was a secretary to the government of India or their mother was a professor. They've had all the advantages of elite education, but merely on the basis of caste, you are giving them an advantage over some poor upper caste person's child. So that argument was accepted by the court. The court said, okay, those who have an income above a certain level, I've forgotten the exact level that was mentioned at that time, the so-called creamy layer of these castes, they will be denied reservations. So suddenly it became an economic issue also. Because, you know, if you talk to someone who's a Dalit representative, like I've spoken to Meera Kumar on this issue, who was a former speaker of the Lok Sabha, Dr. Jagjeevan Ram's daughter, her argument is that social discrimination is irrespective of status and salary and wealth, because if you are a Dalit, in the eyes of some people, you're always a Dalit. They will not sit with you, they will not eat with you, they will not marry you, etc. And therefore, this is a means of compensating for that kind of discrimination. But the dialogue has moved in a direction which says that economic factors must also be taken into account. Otherwise, the creamy layer argument would make no sense. Now, the EWS judgment says that you can give the benefit of reservations to people from any caste, that's mainly to benefit the upper caste, because the others have reservations, who are economically weak. Now, the meaning of this is, I remember there was one of the emotional arguments that was used by somebody on social media was a photograph of a rickshaw puller, you know, wearing a sort of munda, or a langoti, as they would say in the north. He had a sacred thread, so he was a Brahmin. But he was thin, emaciated, you could see his ribs, a poor, poverty-stricken, wizened old man, a human pulling a rickshaw. And people said, is this a person who enjoys privilege, or should his children have an opportunity to benefit from reservation? So that becomes the question that you have to answer. I can tell you that one of the questions I was famously asked by somebody who was from an upper caste, very well-known face, I won't mention his name. He said to me, you can have a backward caste minister's son who has been to the best schools and colleges, able to get into the government with, let's say, 60% marks. And my poor driver is a Nair, his son with 80% is denied admission. He is the son of a driver. He should be the one that the government has more sympathy for than the fellow who had all the advantages and still couldn't score as many marks as the driver's son. Now, these are the kinds of arguments where honestly you can have two different answers. And the court came up with one answer, 3-2, and that was the answer that said, yes, economic reservations are okay. Tomorrow, somebody may come up with a different answer. Our society is reacting to the realities it sees around it. You as civil servants should be very, very aware of all of these problems. But let me say that it's very difficult to say there is only one right answer. Because on both sides, there is justice. People say, as long as you have a country where people discriminate on the basis of caste, then caste must be the basis of granting favors. And others say, in a country where there is so much poverty, caste is not enough. Economic reality must also be taken into account. There is actually a judgment of the Supreme Court 2015 in the Jat reservation case, which is a much more complicated judgment, that says that neither caste alone, nor education alone, nor economic factors alone are enough. The government must come back to the court with a matrix of disabilities on the basis of which people are eligible for reservations. But no government has done so, and no other Supreme Court bench has returned to this idea. I wrote an article about this earlier in the Hindu. I would encourage you to Google it and read that judgment. That's a very serious complication that is there, and these are questions to which there is no finally agreed answer in our society.
Hi sir, myself Nizam Ibrahim. Sir, we know that our parliament is the temple of democracy, but there has been for a democratic nation to sustain, we need qualitative deliberation. But there has been a decline in the quality and quantity of debates, discussions, and even the number of sessions in the parliament. I want to know about, I would like to know about how it affects a democratic country that a parliamentary system is losing its legitimacy into the public.
It is. I agree 100% with you. Our parliamentary system's success depends upon informed debates and discussion, which would lead, as Amartya Sen has argued, to a deliberative democracy. A democracy where issues are thrashed out between the public representatives, and then you actually end up with an informed conclusion. Instead, we have a government that prefers to reduce parliament to a rubber stamp, where its brute majority will always survive. For 8.5 years, I have never seen a single bill brought before Parliament for a vote in which the government made a single amendment that was suggested by an opposition or non-BJP MP. Not one. The only amendments they've ever voted are technical ones, like a bill may have been introduced in 2019 and passed in 2020, so you have to choose the date, so they will offer an amendment to change the date from so-and-so bill 2019 and so-and-so bill 2020. And apart from that, there is absolutely no other amendment they speak. This is not democracy. This is indeed, as VDEM Institute said, as I mentioned earlier, electoral autocracy. They have been elected so they can do what they like and they don't care what anybody else says. This is a genuine problem. You're also right in pointing out that the number of days of Parliament have gone down. That is also very dismaying, because Parliament is an institution which at one time under Nehruji used to meet for about 250 days in the year. Today, it is down to just over about 100 days in the year, and it's really shocking. But we should not forget that when Mr. Modi was Chief Minister of Gujarat, the Gujarat Assembly went down from 180 days to about 56 days in a year. It seems that they only want Parliament to meet for the purposes of passing whatever laws they want to pass, for which they have the majority, and they're not interested in any genuine discussion. That's very, very sad. And I might add that this November, when UPA was in power, every winter session of Parliament used to be convened by mid-November, around 15th of November, and go on till Christmas. As of today, we still don't have the winter session. It is going to start on the 7th of December and go on till 29th. Obviously, for all the Christians, all the people from the northeastern states, even Kerala, after 25th, they will not be able to attend. They'll have to go home for Christmas. Now, in this kind of situation, I find it incredible that the government doesn't care. A 3-week session, good enough for them. They don't worry about having very many days in Parliament behind them. And I would certainly share your concern that this vitiates our democracy.
I am Angel Anajoy. With changing socio-political conditions, caste and religion being intensified and leveraged for personal advantages, is India shifting from a secular democratic country, and will India become a tyranny of majority than a democracy with no way to come back as a true democracy?
Well, there's always a way to come back, which is you can vote somebody else into the government. That's always the way to change a government's approach. But you're right that there are some very worrying trends. You know, when we won independence, it was won on the basis of an understanding. And remember that we were not the only country to be partitioned. Around the same time, you had North and South Korea, East and West Germany, North and South Vietnam. But they were partitioned either on the basis of geography, North one side, South one side, or on the basis of ideology, communist rule on one side and pro-capitalist rule on the other. Whereas in India, it was not geography, it was not North Indians one partition, South Indians another. It was not ideology, it was not capitalists on one side and Marxists on the other. It was very simple on one issue that partition happened, which was the question, is religion the determinant of your nationhood? So those who said that religion is my identity and my nationalism comes from my religion, they created Pakistan. That was the idea of Pakistan, they left. And those who remained in India said, no, our freedom struggle was for everyone of every faith. and we will create a country for people of every faith, and we will not accept that religion determines nationhood. And on that basis, we created an India whose constitution, written over the next couple of years after independence, whose constitution enshrined the idea that everyone is equal, whatever your race, your religion, your caste, your color, your language, your region of birth, nothing mattered. If you are an Indian citizen, you had equal rights. That was the fundamental difference between us and Pakistan. Pakistan, if you are not a Muslim, your passport is stamped non-Muslim. It's almost a confirmation of second-class citizenship. In India, everyone is equal, and everyone of any religion can be, in theory at least, in any position in our country. Now, given that reality, what do we see? We see a situation where the one section of political opinion in India that did not agree with that, that is the Hindutva movement, who believed, like the then All India Muslim League, believed in the idea that religion should determine nationhood and that Hindus and Muslims were two separate nations. Those people actually came, and what did they do? They grew from about 2-3% of the vote in the 1952 general election to a situation where today they have a majority in parliament. And their belief is that India is a purely Hindu country, that all others are here either as guests or have broken into our home as bandits and dacoits. That is the ideology of Hindutva, very clearly stated by the ideologues who have written these books. So they say, Parsis and Jews are like guests because they come and they contribute, they're peaceful, they don't bother anybody. But Muslims and Christians came through invasion, through invaders, so they don't understand our history in South India, where Islam came peacefully, Christianity came peacefully. They don't understand. They only think of Islam coming through the swords of invaders in the north and Christianity coming with the British, because they don't understand the full history of the South. But anyway, these people are the ones who are ruling today, and their narrow-mindedness is influencing all the questions that have raised the concerns in your mind. So you're quite right that we are seeing a situation where people are saying that this is a purely Hindu country, and that those who look to a foreign country for their prayer and their origins of their faith, don't have the same rights in this country. And while we don't have this problem in South India, in the north, unfortunately, there have been very many examples of blatant discrimination against particularly Muslims, the so-called bulldozer diplomacy, the only ones whose homes are demolished. Many people in India construct homes without proper permits. The only ones whose homes are demolished by bulldozers are Muslims. You have passed the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA. The only ones who are thrown into jail as suspected terrorist sympathizers without bail are Muslims. The Citizenship Amendment Act, for the first time, introduces a litmus test that says any refugee from a neighboring country can get fast-track citizenship in India, provided they're not Muslim. So for the first time, you have religion coming in to determine a right of citizenship. All of this is completely shocking, and to my mind is a betrayal of our Constitution. But the Supreme Court has so far not taken a stand saying that this is all unconstitutional. I'm hoping it will come to that. I know there are various legal processes going on, some in High Court, some in the Supreme Court. Eventually, we need to get the government to understand, as long as they are sworn to uphold the Constitution of India, they cannot behave in a manner that is discriminatory against people of other faiths. There is no second-class citizenship in India. We are all equal, and we must fight together to ensure that our equality is preserved. I'm sorry, I've been given a warning that we have to wrap up. One last question, then I have to stop.
Sir, good morning, sir.
Last question.
Sir, I have heard that those who study history...
You'll have to hold the mic very close because your mask makes it difficult to understand you. അല്ല മാസ്ക് ഇട്ടോളൂ വിരോധമില്ല പക്ഷെ മൈക്കിനെ കുറച്ച് അടുത്ത് പിടിച്ചാൽ മതി.
Sir, I have heard that those who study history or those who read immensely can somewhat predict the future, sir. So, as we all know, you are a massive and productive reader. I would like to test your ability regarding this, sir.
But what you heard is not accurate. People who study history can never predict the future.
History repeats itself, sir. And we are, as the title says...
History very rarely repeats itself. It does sometimes echo, but it doesn't repeat. Go on.
As our program title is Thinking Tomorrow with Tharoor.
I think about tomorrow all the time. Go ahead.
Sir, I would like to ask your prediction about the future of our India in its 100 years of age. That is 2047, sir. I would like to know what will be the what will happen to our political, economical, social, economic, and moral situations of our country? Also add a note on democratic values on and religious faith.
The answer is very simple. It depends on you. It depends on you, the people of India. I can assure you that the one strength we have, thanks to our Constitution, is the ability to determine and change our own destiny. We are the ones who have the future in our hands. We don't have to accept tyranny. We don't have to accept autocracy. We can rise and stand up. Don't forget, when the Citizenship Amendment Act was passed, in every city in India there were powerful protests against it. And not only by the Muslims who were the victims, but by Indians who say that citizenship for us applies to all. We will not let you do this. The only thing that saved the government from the protests was the COVID pandemic, when it was no longer possible to gather in public because of the lockdown. And that ended the protests. But the issue has not gone away. And to this day, the government hasn't had the courage to issue the rules to implement the Citizenship Amendment Act. So you have the right. You can determine. Let me tell you that number of opportunities. In fact, I should have mentioned this when that young lady asked the question. One of the opportunities we have is our demographic dividend. We have a lot of young people. You are part of that generation. You can be the engine for a new, growing, dynamic India. And you can decide that you will not accept the reduction of Indian citizenship into one religion or one language or one region. You are the ones who can decide that when economic growth is happening, that you have growth with social justice. You have growth that brings the poor along with you, but you must have growth as well. You are the ones who can determine. Demography, for example, is very interesting. You know what the demographic pattern is? We are now 1.4 billion. Next year, we may overtake China. It was supposed to be happening in 2029, then they said 2026. Now the demographers are saying by 2024 we'll overtake China. We'll be the most populous country in the world. We'll keep growing. We'll go up to 1.6, 1.7 billion. We'll be the most populous country in the world. And then what will happen? It will start declining. Because all of you will have fewer children, and your children will have even fewer children. And the prediction is by 2100 will be 1.1 billion. So demographers can predict the future. But on economics, society, politics, and democracy, it's in your hands. You must decide your own future and the future of India. Thank you all very much. Jai Hind.